I think at my core, I am just a perpetually curious human being who wants to keep learning and doesn't necessarily have like a sense of ego about anything. And so I think I always had this spirit of like, I don't fit into a box. I want to be able to like thread these multiple paths because I couldn't ever see myself as one thing purely. But the reason I fell in love with architecture was like the speculative nature of it and being able to ask these very kind of like really big questions and just pontificate on what could be. And like for me, I was like, there's no way I feel like I know enough about myself to partner with somebody in a really, really committed manner and build a life with them. I don't even know what kind of life I want right now, but I needed it. I needed that to kind of like get myself out of this space of the only thing I can do is be an architect. And to kind of expand my own thinking to say like, where else are your skills transferable as a systems thinker, as a visual communicator, as a storyteller, as, you know, a maker, as this person that has the ability to think about things on multiple scales. Like, what do you call yourself when you have all of those things? And where does that fit in? I get to think about architecture. I get to think about people. I get to think about all of these other like ecological and economic and political and technological forces. And I get to imagine what the world might look like 20 years out in this theoretical, abstract way that does have meaning and influence over the ways we design cities today. You can be, like, we contain multitudes. You can be many things at the same time. And that is actually what makes us human, right?
Welcome back to Be Anomalous, the podcast for the misfits, the trailblazers, the cultural disruptors, and anyone bold enough to carve their own path. I'm Sai Menon, and today's guest is someone whose work quite literally lives in the future. Radha Mistry is a Foresight strategist, designer, educator, and the systems thinker who helps organizations imagine what the next 10, 20, even 50 years could look like. But beyond the titles, Radha is someone who has spent her entire life questioning expectations around culture, career, motherhood, creativity, and what it truly means to belong. Born into a family of architects, raised between countries and cultures, and constantly navigating the space between tradition and individuality, Radha opens up about identity, curiosity, rebellion, parenting, and learning how to build a life on your own terms. This conversation feels deeply human. It's reflective, honest, and full of wisdom for anyone trying to figure out who they are outside of everyone else's expectations. So, wherever you are right now, I'm sure you're going to be able to connect to Radha's conversation. So, let's get into it. Welcome to Be Anomalous. I've been really looking forward to this conversation. And before we get into the nitty gritty of your career, I want to know who you are at your core.
Oh, wow. That is a big question. Who am I at my core? I think at my core, I am just a perpetually curious human being who wants to keep learning and doesn't necessarily have like a sense of ego about anything. So I, have built this career around foresight and future studies, and I started in architecture, but I sometimes look at my kids and I'm like, maybe I don't want to do anything. And I just want to like sit in my garden and grow vegetables and be a ceramicist and get into a smaller scale of making. And so I think, at my core, it's just how to, wanting to stay curious and having that really feed most of my decision making, truly.
I mean, you're a parent now, and I think the ambition or the way you look, your perspective about things and life changed so much. I'm a parent too, so I know how things like drastically change overnight. But before that, what was your career prospects, or like what did you want to be when you grew up?
Oh, so when I was really young, when I was like in elementary school and high school, when I was in elementary school, I'll say, I used to say I wanted to be a teacher, gymnast, and and doctor, like all in one. And so I think I always had this spirit of like, I don't fit into a box. I want to be able to like thread these multiple paths because I couldn't ever see myself as one thing purely. And then when I got into high school and university, that evolved into a love for architecture as a field of practice and a field of inquiry, truly. Because at that time, it felt like it encompassed my love of physics and calculus and history and art and like everything, right? Like I loved calculus because I felt like calculus told the story of physics. And I loved art because it helped me make sense of the world around me. And, and I love to kind of understand how buildings were made because I felt like you were telling a story about somebody's experience through that. And architecture felt like a way into being able to explore all of those things. And so I really wanted to be an architect. I come from a long line of, my father was an architect, my grandfather was an architect. My grandfather had like a practice in India, and then he studied in London and was RIBA certified and all of that. And my great grandfather was a builder and a craftsman and everything. It's like very much in our blood. So I was like, that's what I'm going to do. That's what I'm going to be. And then I did my architectural education, and I went and I got into the field and I practiced, and it just was nothing like what I had experienced in school, right? Which was this like environment where you were really engaging in these big questions and getting to unpack them and just spending so much time marinating on them. And to provide context, I graduated with my MArch into the early 2000s crash, economic crash. So it was just like also not a great time to be in construction in general. And so, again, like I had to kind of rethink how I might transfer those skills, or like if I wasn't going to be an architect, what else might I be? And that went off on a whole other journey of like going to art school in London and stuff like that. So yeah.
But you had your like entire family to see, this profession, but still it was different from what you'd envisioned.
Yeah, I mean, I think my father. I mean, my grandfather had a practice in India, and then by the time he came to the States, he came because my father had come here, and they were basically grandparents at that time. So what the practice of architecture was like in the 70s in a city like New Orleans was very different from my experience in Santa Monica in a 5-person studio, right? And I had these various experiences. I studied in New Orleans for architecture, and I worked at a firm that had, maybe around like 50 people. And we did things like campus redesigns and, hospitals and stuff like that. But the reason I fell in love with architecture was like the speculative nature of it, and being able to ask these very kind of like really big questions and just pontificate on what could be. I was always like a dreamer. So it was like, oh, this is really cool. I can dream up what the world might look like, and people, people's experiences would be really shaped by what I put out into the world. And then you kind of get out into the real world, and you realize it's not just that. It's like permits and money and schedules and construction admin and all of these other things that were part of my education, but were not like an amplified part of my education. And I, and I get this with a lot of my students too, because they will say like, hey, school was great, but now like the real world sucks, and,
Yeah.
and so you kind of have to say, yes, like there is a dissonance between the education of architecture and the practice of architecture. And there are some folks who are willing to kind of go through that journey and become a licensed architect and are fine to wrestle with the permits office and all of that. They get joy out of like, construction documents. And that was never me. I was never that kid, even in university. I would have like, I don't know, 100 conceptual diagrams of what the experience of the built artifact felt like, but I couldn't tell you what the structural system was. right? And so I kind of knew very early on in my education that I wasn't going to be the person making the buildings. I was really interested in building the stories around those spaces. And I wasn't, in that sense, a maker, I would say. So yeah, so I think, and and also at that time it was like we were doing these like interior build outs and renderings for restaurants and boutique hotels and stuff like that, because it was just doing the work that kept the lights on. A lot of these studios were struggling. Major firms had cut like 50% of their staff at that time. Principals were taking pay cuts, right? So it was a really rough time to be in the industry. And so coming into that, where morale is already quite low, it was really hard to seek inspiration from your mentors and to feel like energized about the work we were doing, because everyone felt quite beat down.
Yeah.
So what really drove me at that time was like doing design competitions and side projects. And I think ultimately I realized that the way architecture was being practiced at that time was not something that maybe I was well suited for, but I still really, really valued my architectural education. And I think even looking back now, kind of like 20 years and kind of reflecting on it, I would do the same thing over again because of the lens and the experiences that it's afforded me in my work.
Going back to your childhood, one of the things that you mentioned, which struck me, was the fact that you said, I felt like always I didn't fit into a box. Did that reflect in every other aspect of your life, or is just the academic part of it? Like,
No, it was everything. I'm just thinking that I'm thinking back to just like what it was like to be a child. And I think, I was born in the States, and then we moved and we lived in India and England and Taiwan for a bit.
Wow.
And so at a very young age, I was exposed to lots of different cultures and like had to kind of reckon with like how I fit into those cultures and the context of them, right? India is like where my whole family's from. My parents grew up there. I understood the languages, all of that stuff. But when we moved to Taiwan and England, I didn't truly, it just felt, I was just trying to figure it out. Like I didn't really know what was happening. I was quite young. And so then when we moved back to the States, I remember being like in school and having a really odd accent because I hadn't learned English fully in the US. And we also spoke other languages at home. And so it was like, you already don't fit in that respect, right? And then I think because I went to we lived in a city and in a neighborhood that was quite diverse, there were lots of other languages and lots of other kinds of kids and families around. And so you're also trying to say like, okay, but I don't look like any of them. My parents don't behave like any of them. We don't necessarily prioritize all of the same things. So from that perspective, I already felt like a little bit different. And then I think even just within like the context of my little family, my parents and my brother and myself, I was always the kid that would ask like, why? Like my mother would tell me to do something, and there, we kind of grew up with this, like, this is what is done and this is what is not done. And that was just what was meant to be our guiding kind of force, right? Because that's how she was raised in like 1950s India. And that never sat well with me. I always wanted to understand, like, why do we do this? Why do we make these decisions? Why do we operate in this way? Why is it okay to do this one thing and not this other thing that feels also not harmful? And so I was the kid who was always testing my boundaries, always, right? And I don't think my rebellions like in high school were super crazy. It was like, it was like, I don't know, not showing up for SAT prep or something. It was stuff like that. But I think when it came to thinking about what I wanted to do and what I wanted to be, I was like always interested in art. I never truly, once I got into high school, saw myself in like a super technical kind of oriented profession. I didn't necessarily subscribe to like a conventional model of marriage. I didn't know if I had an image of like, oh, I would love children, but I think it's enough for me to just be partnered, right? Which at this time is not true. I've been married for a while now, but like, but even the way that came about was like a whole meandering kind of path. And so, yeah, and then you have like that in contrast to my brother, who is wonderful, but he did like all the things that my parents were very familiar with, right? We of course both graduated high school, but then he went to business school. He got a degree in economics and finance. He went the FP&A like finance track. He's headed towards being a CFO. He married the pharmacist. He, bought the house, then had the baby, like all of that stuff. And I like graduated high school, went to architecture school, and then was like, I don't want to be an architect. I'm going to move to London and go to art school. And I think that was really scary for my mother, especially because she didn't, even while she was a creative and she went to art school in India and all of that, I don't think she could like see the path forward for me. And being a parent now, I can imagine how like fear inducing that is like, I don't know how to guide you through this, right? As your mother. So yeah, I don't think I made it easy on my mother, but I think it ended up better this way,
I think a lot of it also comes from the fact that you're saying that you're trying to figure out your identity, and then that comes from the rebellious phase of what society expects from you, and you're trying to question that, like it's
Yes.
also like marriage. And even I questioned having a child, because I'm like, do I want to have a child, or is it because that's the conventional path that everyone takes, and that's the
right.
reason why I want to have a child?
Yeah.
So a lot of it is you trying to figure out what you want versus what society wants for you. And I think you were kind of figuring that out, and that comes out in a rebellious stage.
For sure. And I truly believe like this is why I really love New Orleans, and that city will always have a special place in my heart, because one, when my father left India, he settled in New Orleans because he said it reminded him the most of Bombay and like the creative energy and all of that. So we've kind of had roots there since the 1970s. And then I went to university there in the early 2000s. And I felt like it was a place that allowed me to ask questions and make mistakes. And I didn't feel like I always had that. And so I feel like that's truly where I kind of came into my own, because as you said, it's like, I didn't know if I liked the color green because I liked it or because I saw it all around our home and my mother said it was a beautiful color. Right. Yeah. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think it, sometimes it works to like have a very strong guide and a mentor in your life. But I wanted my identity to be my own, and I wanted to come upon it by myself at that time. So
I think it was the gender, like you said with your brother, it was the traditional path that he followed, everything that his, your parents said, versus for you, do you think gender played a role in that?
I wonder. I mean, I will say this, like, to give my mother some credit, I don't think that she held too tightly to the tropes of Indian culture oftentimes, right? Where like you're more lenient on the son and he kind of holds this higher place and stuff like that. But I do think we were very heavily immersed in a South Asian community. And I think those values do just pervade most of life, right? Most of the ways of doing things. So even if it wasn't like explicitly kind of stated, I think there was an implicit feeling of like, well, there's a bit more ease when it comes to the things and the decisions he's making versus the ones I'm making. Now, if I ask my mom, she'll say, oh, I treated you guys the same, like you guys, I love you both the same. You were different kids, but I treated you guys the same. And I think in retrospect, for me, it never felt like that. So I always felt like there was a little bit of like, well, the world is going to look at you differently than they look at your brother. So how can I best prepare you for that? And I don't think, going on a whim, it didn't feel like a whim to me, but to her, it looked like that. Going on a whim to London, to a city where you don't know anybody, to be in art school looks a particular way. And I remember graduating architecture school with my master's, and everyone in my family kind of expecting like, okay, she's got her graduate degree, now she'll get married. And you know, and I remember thinking like, no, I'm not done yet. Like, because at that time, your early 20s was the perfect time to get married. You're 22 years old, you've got a graduate degree, you're so, you know what I'm saying? It's a perfect time to get married. And like for me, I was like, there's no way I feel like I know enough about myself to partner with somebody in a really, really committed manner and build a life with them. I don't even know what kind of life I want right now. Right. And at that time, I also did not subscribe to the kind of model of marriage that I had perceived growing up. So, so it was like confusing to people, I think. And I understood that. And then I, you know, I moved to London because I also was like, I'm not done figuring out who I am. Like, I couldn't really answer that question when people are like, oh, like, what do you want to be when you grow up? Or, you know, what makes Radha Radha? And I felt very confused about that and quite foggy about it. So I felt like I needed to kind of like just get away and go somewhere that felt a little scary almost, and felt really new and unfamiliar, so that I couldn't just kind of settle back into the patterns that felt very familiar to me, right? Like moving back to Los Angeles, where my mother lives and my brother is, and all of that. And I was like, I need to do something like this. I need to do something that feels very, very like outside of myself.
So is that why you chose London?
Yeah, I mean, it was, you know, it's a city that we had been like traveling to since I was a kid. I have an aunt who lives there, and I always romanticized the city and the experience of living there, right? Especially when you read books and stuff like that. Like, it's always like a place that has so much beautiful creative energy. And I think pragmatically, when I was thinking about like a second graduate degree, it was just so much more expensive to go to university in the States than for the kinds of programs I was interested in than to go to like the UK. So it was like half the cost, and I had to fund my own education. So so I really fell in love with this program in London. It was an MA with a focus on narrative environments. And so it was like based in spatial practices, but it focused on the storytelling and the narrative theory part. And I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. This is everything I've been interested in. And I ended up getting into the program and really didn't know anything about the kind of home university, which was Central St. Martin's, which has a very prominent kind of like footing in the fashion world and the design world. But it was almost just like a lucky thing that happened. The university had just moved to a new campus. They had a whole bunch of kind of new programs. And it just felt like a very fresh energy and like a really exciting time to be there. And the city was gearing up to deliver the 2012 Summer Olympics. So this was kind of like the precursor to that. So I had like access to this really beautiful network of artists and creatives as part of St. Martin's in this city that I loved in London, right? And when you're in your like, I don't know, early to mid 20s, I feel like you don't need much to move around, right? And so I was just kind of like figuring it out. I was making friends. I was taking the tube. I was like walking everywhere. I was, traveling on like a really cheap ticket to like Barcelona to do an art project. And finding some really, really beautiful collaborators as well, like people that I still am friends with, that I still do work with. And it just felt like that's really where I started to come into my own as a practitioner, as a designer. And I felt like I could call myself that, like I could call myself a designer. And so it was just, I still talk to my husband. I'm like, maybe we should move to London, like maybe we should like raise our kids there just for a little bit, for them to have that access to kind of like that kind of thinking. But yeah, it was a 2-year program. It went by in a flash. But I needed it. I needed that to kind of like get myself out of this space of the only thing I can do is be an architect. And to kind of expand my own thinking to say, like, where else are your skills transferable as a systems thinker, as a visual communicator, as a storyteller, as, you know, a maker, as this person that has the ability to think about things on multiple scales. Like, what do you call yourself when you have all of those things, and where does that fit in? And I found this company, or they found me, this company called Arup, and their Foresight team, and we did a live project with them, like a client project, and it was on imagining the high street of the future, like 20 years out.
Oh, wow.
Or like in the States, the main street of the future. And it was such a cool project to me, because I was like, wow, I get to think about architecture, I get to think about people, I get to think about all of these other like ecological and economic and political and technological forces. And I get to imagine what the world might look like 20 years out in this theoretical, abstract way that does have meaning and influence over the ways we design cities today, right? And so it felt like I got to kind of like build out these story worlds in a really, really cool way, which I hadn't had a chance to do. And you could get paid for it, which was great too, right? Like, there's a job here. And that was my way into the career path that I've found myself on for the last like 15 years, basically.
That sounds like, I mean, your job sounds so fascinating and so interesting. There's so many facets to that. And you also have to be aware and be in the know about all of these different, systems that you said. Through this process, like the 2 years, I feel like you had to physically get out of that noise,
Yeah.
and then go to London to really understand who you are as a person and what you want from your life. What did you learn in that process?
I learned one, that I always have to be learning. I don't do well in environments where I feel like I've figured it out, or there's nobody there I can kind of like, there's no mentor or nobody there I can learn from. Now that's feeling at this point in my career like a little bit more challenging, but I also think we can always reinvent ourselves. We can always learn something new outside of our kind of chosen industry, right? I think I also learned to have a little bit more confidence in just like calling myself a designer, because I had so much, there was a little bit of like shame there in saying that I went all the way through architecture. I'd got 2 degrees in architecture and I didn't finish my licensing. So I couldn't officially call myself an architect in the United States.
Where do you think the shame came from? Was it within or from like external sources?
I don't think, like, from my family didn't care at that point. I think they were still a little nervous about what was my career going to look like and how was I going to make money. But I always had a job. Like, I always had something. I think it was more internal, because, you know, I went to and it started so young. It's like I went to a high school for overachievers, basically. It was a very, very good high school. It was like the top 10 percentile that had been filtered in from every elementary school. Everyone went to an Ivy League. Everyone got 16, you know, the majority got very high scores on SATs, all of that stuff. And I was like one of the few kids from that school who didn't go into an engineering program or a JD, or, you know, we had kids who were like doing a JD MBA and doing a doctorate and all this stuff. And I went to architecture school, right? And I was like, I'm like putting my future on this decision. But you're also 17.
Yeah.
And how can you make a decision about your life at that age? Our brains aren't even fully formed at that time, you know? And so I think there was a part of me that was like, did I make a misstep here?
Mm.
And it wasn't until I went to London where I really felt like, no, like this is a part of the story of who I am and what I can contribute to the world.
Mm.
And when I kind of had that, because I also then learned about all of these, I used to call them paper architects, but I think the language we have now, we would probably call them like speculative designers, from like the 50s and the 60s and 70s from Japan. There was like the Metabolists, and then there was Super Studio in Italy, and there were there was Ant Farm in the Bay Area in the US, and Archigram out of London. And so I was like happening upon this group of designers and thinkers and writers and dreamers who could put language to what I felt like I wanted to do. And so I could point to something and say, look, this thing, I want to do this, that they do, I want to do that. And I didn't have that before. And so like finally having the language, which I was exposed to in London, having the language to say, I want to work in foresight and future studies. I call myself a designer, but I mean that in the most general terms. And I think it's okay to be curious and to not know exactly what the next 15 years of my life is going to look like. As long as I am still learning, right? That was my baseline. Where am I learning next and who am I learning from? And that has guided every decision in my career, in my life. It's what drew me and my husband to each other, is like, we're both avid readers. And the first conversation we ever had was about books. And it's something we impart on our children. And I just think like, if you can stay curious, you'll be okay.
Yeah. One of the things that that you said, that it's okay not to know where you're going the next 15 years, but professionally, that's what you're doing, where you're predicting the next 20 years.
It's ironic.
So how do you do that? Like, how do you kind of predict the future in terms of like, I mean, it's such a wild fantasy, right? Like to be in that space.
Yeah. I mean, so I'll say, the first thing I'll say is I don't consider what we do to be prediction. I consider it to be provocation. And what we mean by that is it's really my job to help people consider the landscape of uncertainty, all of the factors around us that feel like they are changing, right? So we have this framework we use in Foresight. If folks are coming through like policy, they probably are familiar with it as well. It's called STEEP. So that's the social, technological, economic, ecological, and political kind of forces of change. And we take a look at each of those different lenses and say, okay, in the social realm, if we quiet the noise of all of these, of the four other parts of this framework, what is happening in the technological? So you can kind of start to kind of like isolate each of those factors and consider the ramifications of each of them separately, and then start to have them interact with one another and kind of dream up where this thing might go, right? So the way we often start is we identify what we call weak signals of change. And they are these like quiet whispers of potential futures, basically. So like an example of that might be like, I don't know, like 15 years ago when there were these little labs primarily popping up around the US, but I'm sure there were in other parts of the world as well. It's just where my research was focusing, who were coming up with alternatives to conventional meat. So they were like plant-based proteins, right? If I had brought a white paper or that case study of that little lab in the Bay Area or something and said, this is going to be the future of meat, someone would have looked at me and said, like, you're crazy. No one's going to get rid of beef or chicken or whatever it might be, right? But what we now see is this trend where we're seeing Impossible and Beyond in grocery stores. You're seeing fast food chains adopt that as an option, right? Because they are also recognizing the demand in the market. And so what was this very quiet whisper that probably made me sound like a maniac 15 years ago is a trend and is part of the version of the future that we now consider to be reality, right? You can say the same thing for like autonomous vehicles, for any kind of technological advancement, that at one point it was a small little idea in somebody's head, right?
Yeah.
They built maybe visions or stories or campaigns around it. And the more people started to kind of at least acknowledge its existence or accept that it could be, it could become real in some way, the more it becomes a trend and the less crazy it becomes. And so our job is to really kind of like find those little weak signals, help people prioritize the ones that feel the most important for their business, for their city, for their community, and then start to kind of build these pictures of what that might look like if these things come to fruition. So if autonomous vehicles are all over the city and we're no longer relying on public transportation or Ubers or whatever, what does that look like? Right? Now, obviously, that future is never going to come true where we've completely diminished the role of like public transit and nobody's opting for private kind of stuff. But we have to kind of prototype out these possible futures so that people can then decide what part of this world do I want? And what part of it do I not want? And if I don't want it, does that mean I help to legislate new policy to make sure it doesn't happen? Does it mean that I learn a new skill to understand how to deal with it? Does it mean that I design a new type of product, right, to mitigate or adapt towards this change I'm seeing? And so it helps us to kind of believe we have or recognize that hopefully we have some sense of agency over what happens in these futures because we can design towards them or against them. And we don't have to just resign to the future happening to us.
Okay.
Right. And like the way that most people come upon futures work is through media, through film, through television, through stories. So, famously, like Minority Report is a really good example of that. Is the weak signal there was like the interface that was being used. We didn't have access to that interface, but once people saw it, they wanted it. And that increased the demand. And then you had like technology companies saying, how do we make this happen? And that's what this is like the primary mode of interaction now, right? The interaction model with a lot of our devices. And so it's my job to help build those stories and put them out there so that people can really reckon with them and say, do I want a touch interface? Do I want an autonomous vehicle bringing me to a hospital? Do I want, sea levels to rise? Do I want, like, what can I do to become a part of that story if I choose to be?
So if someone wants to go into this career, what advice would you have for someone at the early stage?
I'll say this, like, if I'm putting my hiring manager hat on, this doesn't make it easier, but I hire from almost any industry and background, because the thing that I'm really looking for is, are you curious? Are you a strong researcher? Are you interested in kind of the world around you? Do you feel like you're a natural kind of storyteller? And have you had exposure to some level of systems thinking, right? Because the Foresight tools and methodologies can be taught, but if you're not interested in understanding kind of systems, or there isn't kind of this like natural born curiosity to like fall into those rabbit holes and find out where something leads you, it makes the work feel very monotonous and overwhelming. So I've hired like recovering architects, I'll call it, right? One of my researchers came from Hollywood. She was a screenwriter, and just really wanted to like get into the research side of it. I've got people from political science backgrounds, from psychology, because they really understand like what might human beings want from a behavioral and cognitive perspective. We have folks who have come from music. I have because they're really good storytellers. I've had folks come from film. So it's just anything that, it tends to be more creative backgrounds. I don't necessarily hire like MBAs. But it really is, do you feel like you're a perpetually curious human being?
What made you go into teaching?
Oh, I love teaching. I went into teaching because I remember being a student and feeling like the professors who could really guide me, or I felt like they were really imparting so much knowledge and wisdom, were the ones who had a foot in practice and a foot in academia. And the ones that kind of were like purely academic, and this is not a knock to anyone purely in academia. I have wonderful dear friends who are career academics. It felt like because I wanted to get out into the world and practice, I felt like they were kind of far removed from what the field looked like. And I never want, and so I kind of had this moment of reflection to be like, I never want to be that person. And so when I got out into the field, and I didn't teach like from the beginning because I felt like I didn't have enough of a perspective to teach. But maybe like 5-6 years ago, I started teaching more regularly, and I loved it because, yes, I was bringing things to my students and I was able to kind of like test out stuff I was working on as well. But your students bring so much to you, and they really help to kind of energize and refresh my point of view on what's happening in the industry, on what young designers are looking for, and like kind of what they're seeking out from the practice. And I think it's this really beautiful like feedback loop, this like dialogue. I always think of my teaching as being in dialogue. And I'm, a lot of my studios and seminars are like very like discussion based, because I just don't think there's in the way that I work, like I don't think just lecturing, lands well. And I think both of us, like both myself and my students, come away with so much more being able to talk things out. And like we've had some really great debates, and on the first day of class, I tell my students, I say like, I don't know everything, but this is what I do know. And feel free to disagree with me, but just keep it respectful. That's it. Right. So I've had students like at the beginning of class be like, I think what you're saying is dumb, like not dumb, but like kind of snake oil. Right. And by the end of class being like, oh, wow, you've really changed my perspective. Right. And my hope for them is always like, I want you to find your own path through this. This is just my path. It doesn't mean it's right or wrong. It's just mine. But yeah, it keeps me on my toes a little bit. I have to, you have to refresh your reading lists and your case studies and like the themes that you bring about. And there's so much that changes from year to year, that I can't just like assign the same assignments because it's not relevant to what young designers are struggling with or being hired for these days. So I like it because it also gives me, like, if I could be in school forever, I would be. I think once my kids get to be a little bit more independent, because they're still quite young, I would love to go for a PhD, just for the fun of it, because I really, really want to be back in school. So it gives me a bit of that like taste of academia. And then I pull stuff back to my team and to my organization to say, this was this cool thing I learned about in my class that the student brought to me. What do you guys think about it? Right. Or, what are we doing to hire like 20 somethings and help them feel really supported when the impacts of climate change and social justice are really on their minds. Right. So it's just, I think it just keeps me grounded, and it kind of keeps me in check so that I also don't get like, I'm not just sitting in a high tower and like saying this is what design is, because design changes. What we make of it, who it serves, how it serves people changes.
I think all of your path that you've chosen speaks the fact that you said in the beginning, no ego, always learning, and wanting to give back.
Yeah.
So were you lucky enough to have good teachers? And do you reflect, like now when you're teaching, do you see those, whatever you got from your mentors or teachers?
I think I do think I was lucky in some ways. I think I had people who really took me under their wing, who invested time in me when they didn't have to. And like opened up my eyes to the possibility of who I could be as a designer. right?
Mhm.
But I think the thing that I really, I mean, like I had like professors in university who were really harsh, but in like a very, I don't know how to explain it, but it's like a very art school, architecture school thing. It's like very harsh, but very loving, you know? It's like, this thing sucks because I know you can do better, you know?
Yeah.
And you're like, yes, I can do better. I was just being lazy. Why did I do this? You know, like push harder. But but I think the thing I struggled with at that time was not seeing myself in my mentors.
Mm.
And I think that's something that's very important to me now. And I have so many, primarily women of color, who reach out to me to say, like, I would love to grab some time with you. I just want to talk about how, you know, how you got to where you are, and if you can provide any feedback or whatever. And I always take those. I always take those emails and those calls and those things, because I think it's so important to pay it forward, and it's so important to like have people that you see yourself in, to even be able to say, I could do that one day. And I think I struggled with that so early on in my career, because there wasn't a table I could sit at. There wasn't a path I could walk, right? I had to kind of like build it. And a lot of my friends who are like women of color at this point in our careers talk about that a lot. A lot of us have had to build our own tables. And so why not bring others along?
Yeah.
You can do that, right? So yeah, I mean, I had, like I said, like I had people who really did like go out on a limb for me and take me under their wing. But there were so many parts of the ways that I had to walk through the world that they didn't necessarily understand. So for me, there was a lot of like just putting myself out there and making mistakes, and sometimes feeling very confused. And not always knowing if I was making the right decision, or, you know, because I think also when you're young, you feel like you have to make the right decision.
Yeah.
And I think as I get older, I realize like that's not a thing. You just have to decide to move forward in one way or another and kind of figure it out as you go along. Yeah, I don't think I'd be where I am without that. Like even peers of mine who like saw that I was interested in foresight, or saw that I was interested in design fiction or speculative design, whatever it might be, and would say like, hey, like read this article, or come to this lecture with me, or let's go to this like, you know, new exhibition that's popping up, or like I would not be where I am in my career without those people. So I'm like very grateful to them. And I think that's why such a big part of what I spend time on is mentoring other people, other folks, so that there's like more people who look like me in my industry, because that's not how it was when I first started.
Have you reconciled with the shame and also feeling like you fit into a box, or at least feel like I don't need to fit into a box?
I feel like I don't need to fit into a box, you know, like my I was cooking dinner the other day, and my daughter, she's almost 4. She came up. She came up into the kitchen and like pulled her stool over and was just decided to draw on the counter beside me. And I love that, like, you know, those little moments. And she said, Mama, I'm an artist. And she said, Mama, when I grow up, I'm going to be a teacher and an artist and an architect and a mommy. And my husband from the other room was like, oh, Somya, it sounds like you're trying to be like mommy. And she goes, no, I'm trying to be like Somi.
Oh.
That's what she calls herself. So that's what we call her. And I love that, because I love that, like, one, I just want my kids to be who they are.
Yeah.
And I want to help them do that. I don't have a vision for like, you're going to get married one day and no, she's going to be who she is. How do I help you become that person? And I also love that, like, she doesn't feel like at this young age, she has to fit into a box, right? You can be like, we contain multitudes. You can be many things at the same time. And that is actually what makes us human, right? And so, yeah, I mean, I don't feel shame. I genuinely at this stage in my life, and I still am, I feel like quite young. But at this stage in my life, I feel very grounded. And I feel like I don't know where my path is headed. Like I said, maybe in 10 years' time, I do a completely different career. But I don't feel every decision I've made is part of my story.
Yeah.
Right. And it's brought me to this point. And I think that is okay, Yeah.
How did you choose to change your decision about marriage and kids?
Yeah. My husband convinced me. No, I'm just kidding. You know what it was? I think it was like meeting the person who was willing to co-create that model with you, right?
Yeah.
And I think I had experiences in the past, primarily within the culture, like my culture, where my partners at that time subscribed to the same way of thinking that we had been raised by and raised with. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think it works for some people. And I think for me, it just didn't. And I at some point I realized I did want to have children, but I didn't want to be the only one, the primary person raising them. And I didn't want to be the primary person responsible for like our home. And my husband and I talked a lot about like how important our creative parts of ourselves are, and the fact that our lives don't need to be rooted in any one place. And what we felt the balance of like work in the home was, right? The things that have typically been deemed women's work.
Mm-hmm.
And so when, to be like super out of the box, like we had Somya before we got married. And part of that for me, of course, was like a shock to my family. And also my husband is not Indian. But part of that for me was like, I know I want to have children with this person. I want to experience what he's like as a father and what I'm like as a mother, and like how we can kind of like build this world around our children. And the marriage part genuinely for us came from like keeping it comfortable for our families. Because for them, they couldn't conceive of the like, wait, so you can have kids and you can live a life together and you can be committed to one another, but you're not married, right? The government does not recognize your union, right? And at one point my husband was like, man, we're in it together forever, right? Like, so why not just get married? Let's like just make it easy for everyone to understand. And I will say, like, now I really love it. Like, I love being able to like call him my husband and whatever that means, and feel like, okay, we are truly committed to one another. And that's what it has turned into for me, right? It used to feel like when you get married, you become a wife and you have a duty to your family and your in-laws. And that doesn't feel like that for me anymore. It feels like I get to build this beautiful little world with this person and my children. And like the other day I was just like in our backyard and I was just looking around and I like looked up at the sky and I was like, man, thank you for this. Like, I'm not deeply religious, but I was like, universe, thank you. This is great. Wherever we've ended up is wonderful. And like, I don't know where we're headed, but this is so wonderful. And it's just that. It's like, if I want to get a PhD in 10 years time, my husband's like, go for it. If we want to move to a different city, we'll figure out how to make that happen. And the vision of like, you buy the house and you have the child and you stay there for 20 years until they go to university. And that was what felt very constricting and like suffocating for me. But I recognize that is also somebody else's dream.
Yeah.
And that's wonderful for them. Right. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, our house is filled with books and like things to draw with and paint with, and and we get to like travel and expose our kids to different things, and we also then get to like sit in the backyard and eat popsicles and like and pluck eggplants and tomatoes from our garden. And it's just like this cute little existence that I didn't know was possible until I met the person who I was able to kind of build that vision of the future with.
I think you've been constantly throughout your career or throughout your life, you've been changing the definition of what each of these words meant, because that was what was presented to you.
Yeah.
So marriage was a certain way, but you were like, no, there can be another definition, and you redefined it in the way that you wanted it to be. And being a mother was redefined in your sort of way that you wanted it to be.
Yeah.
I think that's really hard, but you kind of figured the path.
Figuring it out. Yeah. Haven't figured it out yet. Figuring it out. It's a journey. But yeah. Yeah.
So how did parenthood change everything? I feel like,
Wow.
especially, coming from, even I have Indian parents, and it's I feel like a lot of it comes from the societal. Their time was so different. What they could do, they did best for us. And
Yeah.
also, they were really young parents. So now I talk to my mom about all the things, and she was like, I don't know what I was doing,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
sometimes she apologizes for the things that she's doing. And I also, this is a statement that I keep, hearing from the previous generation parents, that when you're a parent, you will understand. And honestly, I don't. There's
Yeah.
a lot of things I'm like, no, I don't, because I just want to see my son. My son is also about 4.
Oh, so sweet.
He, like, I just want to see him be happy. That's all
Yeah.
that matters.
Yeah.
I don't really care what career he ends up in, or I don't really care who he chooses. I mean, if he wants to be, have a partner or not have like, as long as he's happy, that's all that matters.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably from our own experiences.
Yes.
So how has parenthood changed your vision, your way of thinking? Because you've already had so much of experiences in terms of like teaching. You've exposed yourself to different culture.
Yeah. I will say, I think parenting for me has been very healing. And not in the sense of like I'm trying to live vicariously through my child. It's like I'm getting to redo and relive some of the interactions I grew up with. Because, from my parents actually pretty atypically got married quite late. So my mother was like 32 when she got married,
Okay.
and 34 when she had me, which is the same age I had my child, my first kid.
Okay.
And my father was in his late 30s, like early 40s. So, because my mom did basically the same thing I did. Like she went to art school and she was in theater and she used to model and all this stuff. And then I think the world and her mother, maybe her family, was like, well, this is just not done. Like our family doesn't do this, right? So get married because it's like the best thing for you. And I think the model of motherhood that I saw growing up was that like my mom kind of like martyred herself. Like she just did everything for everybody and like lost her sense of who she was. And I know for her that was an act of love and I appreciate it. But I think what happens is your kids leave your home and then you kind of have to like, figure out who you are again. And now like in her 70s, she's like gotten back into painting and all of that stuff, right? Which is so lovely. But I remember feeling like I don't want that for myself.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's like 2 parts of this for me in being a parent, which is I really love it. It's so fun. But how can I undo some of the patterns that I grew up with, right? To also like, if I do something that where I didn't show up as the best version of myself in front of my kids, I will apologize to them. I will say, Mommy didn't have it today. I'm so sorry. I will do better tomorrow, right? We never heard that growing up. I never heard that growing up. And my daughter, especially, my son doesn't speak yet. He's like only 1. But my daughter, especially, she'll like ask me questions, or she'll say, Mama, I didn't feel like you were very kind when you said that. And I love that because that means she can stand up for who she is, right?
Yeah.
And she knows the kind of behavior she deserves and when she needs to step away.
Yeah.
And I didn't have that. I was like such a people pleaser and I felt like everything was my fault. And, are you mad at me? Right. That was such a big thing. And that it was my duty to make sure everybody else was okay.
Yeah.
And it's not. And the freeing yourself from that is such an act of like just liberation. And I just, I think it's just been really healing. And I like, we don't get it right every single day, but we figure it out. And the fact that like my daughter will, like, she understands that anger is an okay emotion, right? It's a productive emotion, but you also release it and you move through it, right? And that negative, what we've deemed negative feelings are still helpful to us to understand and position ourselves and our bodies and our brains. So, It's just like, but this is stuff I didn't know.
Yeah.
Right. And so what you end up doing is you like, you move out of the house at 17 and you maybe like self-medicate with lots of things that you shouldn't be self-medicating with. And and so I think like, I don't want that for my children. They will have their own issues and hopefully they're very tiny ones. Right. But what parenting has given me, one, it's made me be able to prioritize things and set boundaries very, very hard. So, between 4 and 7, that is my time with my family. I do not take meetings at that time. I will be offline. I might sign back on when my kids go to bed. But you don't have access to me at that time if it's a work thing, right? In the event of an extreme emergency, sure. But like, my family is the thing that's really important to me. And I remember my therapist asking me once, she's like, Radha, this is early on when I was like a year into just being a new mom. She said, Radha, what's your priority? And I listed like these things. She said, great, you choose one. You can't prioritize everything, right? She said, you can have it all, but you can't have it all at the same time. And so I was like, oh, she said, it's okay to say you want to be a mother right now.
Yeah.
It's okay to say my career is gonna go to the back for a bit. I've been giving it so much attention for so many years.
Yeah.
Trust that it's moving at its own pace.
Yeah.
Right. And like be okay with like sitting in the backyard eating a popsicle and not feeling like you have to publish something tomorrow or say yes to that talk in New York or whatever it is. Right. And so I think parenting has also grounded me a little bit and like ironically brought a bit of ease to my world, which is weird to say with a 1-year-old and a 4-year-old, but like I just feel like my instinct for who I am and how I want to operate in this world feels more like certain. Right now, call me like in 10 years time when my kids are teenagers and I'm like, I don't know what I'm doing, but like, right. Every year is different. It just gets different. But, yeah, it's just, I'm kind of just more comfortable in who I am. And I feel like I'm getting to kind of heal parts of me that I didn't allow myself access to for a very long time. And that's been really wonderful, honestly.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Yeah.
One of the things that you had mentioned earlier about your mom preparing you in terms of you and your brother, and you're in a similar position now with your daughter and son. Have you, at this moment, because you're still really young, felt that difference that you might have to parent them different because the world is not going to, because obviously at home it's not going to be, you're not going to have those gender roles, but he has to be prepared when she moves outside.
Yeah, I mean, I will say the one contextual difference that's quite major is my husband is Black, so my children are half Black. And I have to think about how my son is perceived in the world as a Black boy.
Yeah.
Right. And so for me, that's something that my husband is like definitely has to take the lead on. But I think in that way, like I also have to leave space for raising my children and having to learn things that I never knew about, right, to prepare them for the world. So I feel like I'm kind of in a same space as my mother of like, I don't know how to guide you in all of these ways because the world does not see me as I'm an Indian woman. I walk the world as an Indian woman, and women have our own challenges, but like, I do not know what it's like at all to walk in the world as a Black man. I could never imagine what that looks like. Right.
Yeah.
So there's a little bit of that part, but I already see like, my daughter has very big feelings, like very expressive, very big feelings. My son is super chill. And I don't know if that's just like a second sibling thing, my husband and I say like with the second, we were also less anxious. So maybe that's part of like the energy in the house felt more calm.
Yeah, that's true.
And so I think that he's like, he kind of just like sees what's going on and he's kind of just like figuring it out. But I don't know who they're going to be. Both of them, like my daughter especially seems very creative right now. And she's like, loves to sing and loves to draw and loves to paint and dance and all of that. And, I just hope that when they come to me with something I don't agree with, that I can make space for it. Right? Because so much of like, I feel like the hardest parts of my experience growing up was meeting resistance from my parents. And you put so much energy into that you almost don't have the chance to figure out who you are in the process of going through that. And so like, if I can reduce the friction in like their process of finding themselves, then and it'll probably be different for both of them, right? Like I might have to sit with Somi and be like, hey baby, like let's talk about your feelings, but this is a little problem, not a big problem, you know, or things like that. And I don't know if maybe the thing with my son is to have him be more vocal about his feelings and emotions, because that's something that my husband learned later in his life, is like how to say, you know, you hurt my feelings. And to have that come from a very vulnerable place, you know. So I think the thing that I do want to do is like to give them both the language to express themselves and who they are in the whole realm of human experience. Because like, I think for me growing up, I wasn't ever allowed to say, I'm angry with you. You have done something to hurt my feelings. Right. And to not be able to say that, you suppress and you suppress and you suppress, and you feel like you're a bad person for feeling this way. So yeah, I don't know if I'll have to, like, I'm sure I'll have to treat them a little bit differently, but I think it's not necessarily like treating them differently, but making space for who they show up as in different ways, and treating them the same to say that like, yes, if you want to get married or don't, if you want to go to university or there's a different education path, if you want to explore this thing, cool, like go out there into the world. But yeah, with that one caveat of, you know, which sometimes is a little bit like fear inducing for me, but I have to recognize, but that's my feeling. That's my thing, is like, how will the world perceive my children as half Black, half Indian kids and half Black, half Indian adolescents and grown-ups, right? But I've also, like, my husband says that, you know, if someone asked him 1,000 times over, he would be born Black, because there's so much joy in that community, and there's so much love and so much to celebrate. And like, I feel the same way about my culture. So, you know, how lucky that our kids get like the best of these worlds. So yeah,
and they'll have their unique stories, and
they will.
I mean, it's just beautiful. I feel like in the initial stage, you're kind of trying to figure it out and you walk away from your culture, but then you always come back. I feel like when you're a young adult, you always come back because you want to know your roots and you just want to identify who you are. So I feel like kids will sort of figure that out.
Yeah, no, and I'll say, like, my mom, you know, I grew up Hindu because my mother, and like I went to Sunday school and all of that stuff, because my mom used to say to me, like, I don't need you to be deeply religious, but I don't know how to teach you what it is to be Indian without sharing the religion, because they're so deeply intertwined, for her at least. And like I said, I'm not deeply religious anymore, but like it is important for me, for my children to understand, like, you know, what India is and like what Indian culture is, and to impart those bits of knowledge and like experience on them, because I definitely don't want them growing up not having a connection to like where they've come from. You know?
Yeah, that's important.
Yeah.
I can keep talking to you, Radha, all day long, but we always end this conversation with a favorite quote that you live by and a favorite book.
Oh goodness. A favorite book is there's this book called Trick Mirror, which I really love. And it's a collection of essays. And I think the writing is just exquisite, and it's like just essays about the experience of growing up as a woman in this country, in a particular time, right? Like late 80s, early 90s. As a child of immigrants, and I just love that. I read it years ago and it still sticks with me.
I have to read it.
Yeah, please read it. It's just like written in a really lovely way. It's not pretentious. It's not like, you know, um super dense in its language. And I read it and it felt like an exhale, I guess is the way I describe it. And then a favorite quote. There's one, but I can't fully remember it. It's by Buckminster Fuller, and it's like, we're called to be architects of the future, not what is it? Called to be architects of the future, not its victims.
Oh.
And I really love that. It's something that I found like very early on in my career, and I think it's very much guided my point of view on my role as a designer. But yeah, that would be my quote.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Radha. This was such a wonderful conversation, and I feel like we have so many similarities in terms of our culture and, with kids.
Yeah. Thank you so much. This was lovely.
So that was my conversation with Radha. What stayed with me from this conversation is this idea that you don't have to fit into one identity, one career, one definition of success, or one version of yourself forever. Radha reminds us that life is allowed to evolve, and so are we. From architecture to foresight, from questioning cultural expectations to creating her own version of motherhood and partnership, her story is such a powerful reminder that curiosity can become a way of life. You don't need to have every answer figured out. Sometimes the most meaningful paths are the ones you build while you're still discovering yourself. If this episode resonated with you, please like, share, and subscribe, and share it with someone who is navigating or questioning expectations or trying to carve out their own path in the world. As always, thank you for being part of Be a Normalist community. And as always, be bold, be real, and be a normalist.